Theodore Roosevelt, born in 1858 in New York City, was not an ordinary child. From a young age, he struggled with severe asthma and frail health. But his parents encouraged him to develop both his mind and body. While other children played casually, young Theodore immersed himself in books, nature, and disciplined physical activity. This combination of mental curiosity and physical determination shaped the man who would one day revolutionize the United States. Roosevelt's childhood was marked by a fascination with the natural world. He studied insects, birds, and the landscapes of New York, often exploring the countryside with keen observation. His love for history and politics also began early, reading about the founding fathers, European monarchs, and the complexities of government. These dual passions, nature and governance, laid the foundation for his later policies that intertwined environmental conservation with political reform. In his teenage years, Roosevelt faced criticism for his small, weak body. But instead of succumbing to frustration, he adopted a rigorous routine of exercise, boxing, horseback riding, and hunting. This relentless drive not only strengthened his body but also honed his character, teaching him resilience, courage, and the importance of personal responsibility. These traits would become defining features of his public life, as he confronted corruption, challenged corporate monopolies, and led a nation through economic and social transformation. After graduating from Harvard in 1880, Roosevelt entered public life, initially as a politician in the New York State Assembly. Even at this early stage, his reform-minded approach set him apart. He championed labor rights, fought political corruption, and advocated for public service reforms. These experiences, although localized, foreshadowed the sweeping economic and social changes he would later implement as President of the United States. Roosevelt's philosophy was shaped by a belief in the strenuous life, the idea that citizens and leaders alike must embrace challenges, take responsibility, and engage actively in society. He believed that government existed not just to maintain order but to improve the lives of ordinary people, regulate corporate abuses, and ensure justice. This conviction would later manifest in policies that directly altered America's economic system, labor laws, and conservation practices. As the sun set over the bustling streets of New York City, young Theodore's mind wandered to the possibilities of what one determined individual could achieve. Little did the world know that this boy, who once struggled to breathe through asthma attacks, would grow into a president who would reshape the economic, environmental, and social landscape of the United States forever. After establishing himself as a reformer in New York politics, Theodore Roosevelt sought to challenge himself beyond the state assembly. In 1898, when the Spanish-American War broke out, he saw an opportunity not only to serve his country but to prove that Americans could rise to any challenge, physically and morally. Roosevelt resigned his government post and organized a volunteer cavalry regiment famously known as the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were not a conventional army unit. Composed of cowboys, miners, Native Americans, and Ivy League athletes, the regiment represented Roosevelt's belief in the strenuous life, that courage, discipline, and personal responsibility transcended social class. Under Roosevelt's leadership, the Rough Riders trained rigorously, emphasizing both physical stamina and moral fortitude. This preparation reflected Roosevelt's early life philosophy, confronting challenges head-on, no matter the obstacles. Their most famous battle, the charge up San Juan Hill, became a symbol of Roosevelt's bravery and strategic leadership. Despite intense Spanish fire, Roosevelt led his men from the front, inspiring them to persevere when retreat seemed easier. The victory not only earned him national fame but also established his reputation as a leader who combined courage, vision, and an unwavering sense of duty. His actions on the battlefield reinforced his belief that leadership required both moral conviction and active engagement, a principle he carried into his presidency. Upon returning from war, Roosevelt parlayed his newfound fame into political capital. He served as governor of New York, where he continued his crusade against corruption, monopolistic business practices, and political cronyism. Roosevelt's approach was bold. He challenged powerful corporate interests directly, enforcing regulations and promoting fairness in commerce. This experience gave him first-hand insight into the economic imbalances of the nation and prepared him to implement nationwide reforms. Roosevelt's philosophy of progressive government began to crystallize during these years. He believed that the government had a responsibility to protect the public from the abuses of powerful corporations while simultaneously fostering opportunity for ordinary citizens. This balance, strengthening both the economy and social justice, would later define his presidency and his efforts to modernize America's economic system. By the time he became vice president under William McKinley, Roosevelt had already demonstrated a consistent pattern: confront challenges boldly, pursue reform relentlessly, and inspire the nation to uphold both moral and practical responsibility. These early experiences, the Rough Riders, the battlefield, and New York politics, would directly influence his later policies on economic regulation, conservation, and social justice. As Roosevelt's fame grew, Americans began to see a new kind of leader emerging, one who combined vigor, principle, and a vision for a stronger, fairer nation. The young reformer from New York had become a national figure, ready to leave a lasting imprint on the economic and political life of the United States. In 1900, Theodore Roosevelt became the Vice President of the United States under President William McKinley. Although some politicians saw the position as ceremonial, Roosevelt viewed it as an opportunity to observe and prepare for larger responsibilities. He continued his reformist mindset, watching closely how national and corporate powers influenced the economy, labor, and the daily lives of Americans. Tragically, in 1901, President McKinley was assassinated, and Roosevelt, at only 42 years old, became the youngest president in U.S. history. Suddenly, he held the power to implement his vision for a nation on the brink of transformation. Unlike many predecessors, Roosevelt was not content with passive leadership. He believed the government must act decisively to curb corruption, protect the public, and modernize the economy. One of his first significant economic actions was the fight against monopolies and corporate trusts. At the turn of the 20th century, a few giant companies controlled entire industries, manipulating prices and limiting opportunities for smaller businesses. Roosevelt, who earned the nickname Trust Buster, sought to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act strictly. He targeted unfair practices by corporations, forcing some to break up and regulating others to ensure competition and fairness. This policy sent a strong message: economic power must serve the nation, not dominate it. Roosevelt also championed the Square Deal, his domestic program emphasizing fairness for workers, businesses, and consumers alike. He understood that America's rapid industrialization had created serious social inequalities. Workers faced long hours, unsafe conditions, and low wages. Roosevelt's Square Deal introduced reforms to protect labor, regulate railroads, and guarantee that the growing economy benefited more than just the wealthy elite. Conservation was another critical aspect of Roosevelt's early presidency. He believed that America's natural resources were essential not only for commerce but also for the nation's long-term prosperity and health. Under his leadership, millions of acres of land were preserved as national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges. These efforts reflected a broader vision, a strong economy and a healthy sustainable environment must go hand in hand. By the end of his first years in office, Roosevelt had already reshaped the relationship between government and the economy. He proved that the president could act boldly to challenge entrenched powers, protect ordinary citizens, and modernize national institutions. Americans began to see him not just as a leader, but as a transformative figure capable of changing the very structure of the country's economic and political life. Roosevelt's early presidency set the stage for further reforms, including progressive labor laws, stronger corporate oversight, and initiatives that would define the United States as a modern, fair, and dynamic nation. His vision extended far beyond the immediate crisis. It was a blueprint for a more just, economically balanced, and sustainable future. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency was defined by action, bold, decisive, and unprecedented. One of his core beliefs was that the government had a duty to ensure fairness, not just for corporations but for every citizen. The rapidly industrializing economy of America had created immense wealth for a few, while many workers suffered under harsh conditions. Roosevelt recognized that economic growth without justice was unsustainable, and he set out to change it. A major pillar of Roosevelt's reforms was the regulation of big businesses, especially monopolies and trusts. Industries like oil, railroads, and steel were dominated by a handful of corporations controlling prices and limiting competition. Roosevelt's administration broke up several large monopolies, including the Northern Securities Company, sending a strong message that no company was above the law. His policies encouraged fair competition, protecting small businesses and consumers alike. Roosevelt also took a strong stance on labor rights. During his presidency, the coal strike of 1902 became a defining moment. Miners were striking for better wages and safer working conditions, and the strike threatened to paralyze the nation. Instead of siding only with the business owners, Roosevelt intervened as a mediator, ensuring the workers received a fair settlement. This was revolutionary. For the first time, the federal government actively protected labor while maintaining economic stability. In addition, Roosevelt implemented progressive reforms aimed at public welfare. He pushed for stricter food and drug regulations after exposing unsafe practices in the meatpacking industry, a campaign famously highlighted by Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle. These reforms led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, safeguarding consumers and improving public health. Roosevelt's Square Deal philosophy emphasized three key principles: control of corporations, preventing abuse of power by monopolies; consumer protection, ensuring products were safe and fairly marketed; conservation of natural resources, preserving America's land, forests, and wildlife for future generations. On the environmental front, Roosevelt established 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and over 150 national forests, setting a precedent for conservation. He believed that a healthy environment was essential for a thriving economy and society. Through these actions, Roosevelt fundamentally reshaped the economic system of America. He balanced industrial growth with fairness, labor rights, consumer protection, and environmental stewardship. Americans began to see their government not merely as an administrative body, but as a force capable of ensuring justice, stability, and opportunity for all. By the end of Part 4, it became clear that Theodore Roosevelt was more than a president. He was a reformer whose policies would transform the nation's economy, society, and government, leaving a legacy that continues to influence the United States today. Theodore Roosevelt's vision for America extended far beyond its borders. While his domestic reforms transformed the economy, His foreign policy aimed to establish the United States as a global power capable of influencing international trade, security, and diplomacy. Roosevelt famously summarized his approach with the phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." This principle guided his actions in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, strengthening America's strategic and economic position. One of Roosevelt's most enduring accomplishments was the construction of the Panama Canal. This monumental project connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, dramatically reducing shipping time and costs for global trade. Roosevelt recognized that controlling a canal was not merely an engineering challenge, but a crucial economic and geopolitical advantage. The canal enabled faster movement of goods and military vessels, positioning the United States as a central player in global commerce. To secure the project, Roosevelt supported Panama's independence from Colombia, negotiating a treaty that allowed the U.S. to oversee the canal's construction. While controversial, this decisive action reflected his belief that America needed to actively shape international events to protect national interests. The Panama Canal would go on to generate immense economic benefits, increase trade efficiency, and cement Roosevelt's legacy as a strategic leader. Beyond the canal, Roosevelt expanded America's influence through the Great White Fleet, a fleet of battleships sent on a world tour to demonstrate the nation's growing naval power. This show of strength reassured allies, deterred potential adversaries, and encouraged international respect for American economic and military capabilities. Roosevelt understood that a strong military and proactive diplomacy were intertwined with economic growth, trade, security, and influence were inseparable in his vision. Additionally, Roosevelt mediated the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, earning the Nobel Peace Prize. By negotiating a fair settlement, he prevented further conflict, strengthened global stability, and elevated the United States as an arbiter of international disputes. His diplomatic interventions demonstrated that America could play a constructive role on the world stage while protecting its economic and strategic interests. Through these foreign policy initiatives, Roosevelt expanded America's reach, opened new markets, and reinforced domestic economic reforms. He understood that a strong economy at home required strength abroad, and that leadership in global affairs would ensure prosperity, security, and influence for generations to come. By the conclusion of Part 5, it was evident that Roosevelt had not only transformed the domestic economic system, but had also positioned the United States as a powerful, respected, and economically strategic nation on the global stage. While Theodore Roosevelt is often remembered for his reforms in business and labor, another cornerstone of his presidency was his vision for conservation. Roosevelt believed that America's natural resources were not limitless and that responsible stewardship of forests, rivers, and wildlife was essential for the nation's long-term prosperity. He recognized that economic growth, public health, and national pride depended on protecting the environment. Roosevelt's conservation policies were unprecedented. Before his presidency, there was little systematic effort to protect America's wilderness. Forests were being logged recklessly, rivers polluted, and wildlife populations declining. Roosevelt used his authority to establish the United States Forest Service, appointing Gifford Pinchot as its first chief. Together, they promoted sustainable forestry, ensuring that timber and other resources could be harvested responsibly without depleting the land. During his tenure, Roosevelt protected approximately 230 million acres of public land. He created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests, laying the foundation for America's modern conservation system. These protected lands preserved the natural beauty of the country, provided habitats for countless species, and offered Americans spaces for recreation and reflection. The Roosevelt administration also emphasized wildlife preservation. Hunting regulations were implemented to prevent overhunting. An endangered species received government protection. Roosevelt understood that biodiversity and environmental health were directly connected to a sustainable economy. By conserving natural resources, he ensured that future generations could enjoy both economic opportunity and the richness of America's landscapes. Roosevelt's conservation philosophy was intertwined with his broader progressive agenda. Just as he fought monopolies to maintain economic fairness, he believed that the government must intervene to protect public lands from private exploitation. He argued that the environment was a national treasure, vital to the well-being of all citizens, not a commodity for short-term profit. The long-term impact of Roosevelt's environmental policies was profound. National parks and forests became pillars of American identity, boosting tourism, creating jobs, and supporting local economies. His foresight ensured that economic growth could coexist with environmental protection, a balance many modern policymakers continue to strive for. By the end of Part 6, it was clear that Theodore Roosevelt's vision went beyond immediate political victories. He transformed America's relationship with its natural resources, establishing principles of sustainable development, conservation, and environmental responsibility that continue to guide the nation today. Theodore Roosevelt's domestic legacy was built on a foundation of fairness, courage, and active government intervention. By the time he had completed his first term as president, Roosevelt had fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the federal government, business, and labor. His policies reflected a deep understanding that economic growth alone was not enough. It had to be paired with justice, fairness, and sustainability. Trust busting and corporate regulation. Roosevelt's reputation as a trust buster stemmed from his bold action against monopolies and corporations that exploited workers, consumers, and smaller competitors. By enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, he dismantled major corporations that restricted competition and abused market power. Industries such as railroads, oil, and tobacco faced strict oversight. This was not just a legal battle, it was a moral stand, asserting that economic power must serve society rather than dominate it. The consequences were immediate and long-lasting. Small businesses flourished, consumers enjoyed fairer prices, and the government set a precedent for regulating corporate behavior. Roosevelt's trust-busting sent a clear message. The federal government had both the authority and the responsibility to ensure equitable economic practices. Labor reforms. Labor relations were another critical arena of Roosevelt's reformist vision. Industrialization had brought unprecedented wealth, but workers often faced long hours, dangerous conditions, and low wages. Roosevelt's intervention in the coal strike of 1902 exemplified his approach. He mediated between striking miners and business owners, guaranteeing fair wages and safer working conditions without disrupting the national economy. This marked a revolutionary moment in American governance. For the first time, the president actively protected workers' rights while maintaining economic stability. Roosevelt's labor reforms reflected his belief in a square deal, where both business and labor had obligations to society, and fairness was the guiding principle of national policy. Long-term economic impact. The combination of trust-busting and labor reform reshaped America's economy for generations. Competition increased, wages stabilized, and consumer confidence grew. Roosevelt's policies laid the groundwork for progressive taxation, regulatory frameworks, and labor protections that would evolve throughout the 20th century. Moreover, Roosevelt's holistic approach, linking economic growth with social justice and environmental stewardship, established a new standard for presidential leadership. Citizens began to see the government not as a distant arbiter but as a proactive force capable of balancing power, protecting rights, and guiding the economy towards sustainable growth. By the end of Part 7, it was evident that Theodore Roosevelt had achieved something extraordinary. By the end of Part 7, it was evident that Theodore Roosevelt had achieved something extraordinary. He redefined the role of government in the economy, ensuring that prosperity was inclusive, responsible, and forward-looking. His domestic policies were more than reforms. They were a blueprint for the modern American state. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency was a turning point in American politics because it redefined the very relationship between government and the people. At the heart of his domestic vision was the Square Deal, a progressive framework designed to guarantee fairness for workers, businesses, and consumers alike. The Square Deal was more than a slogan. It was a guiding philosophy that shaped every aspect of Roosevelt's policies. The three pillars of the Square Deal: control of corporations. Roosevelt understood that unchecked corporate power threatened democracy and fairness. By regulating monopolies and enforcing antitrust laws, he ensured that companies served the public good, not just their own profits. This principle reinforced economic competition and protected small businesses from exploitation. Consumer protection. Following revelations from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and widespread concerns about unsafe products, Roosevelt championed legislation like the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. These laws guaranteed that consumers could trust the food and medicines they purchased, establishing government accountability and public safety as top priorities. Conservation of natural resources. Roosevelt believed that the nation's economic and social health was inseparable from its environment. Through the creation of national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges, he preserved millions of acres of land, ensuring that America's natural wealth remained accessible and sustainable for future generations. Public perception and leadership style. Roosevelt's boldness and direct approach captivated the public. Unlike many politicians of his era, he spoke directly to the people, using newspapers, speeches, and personal charisma to rally support for reforms. Citizens admired his energy, courage, and moral clarity, which contrasted sharply with the passive and often corrupt leadership common in the early 20th century. His public image, energetic, decisive, and relatable, helped ensure the success of progressive reforms. Americans began to trust that the government could act in their interests, not just those of the wealthy elite. Roosevelt's visibility and transparency bridged the gap between government and citizens, fostering a sense of shared responsibility and national unity. Impact on American politics. The Square Deal laid the foundation for future progressive reforms, including labor protections, environmental regulation, and social justice initiatives. It marked a shift toward active government intervention in economic and social affairs, emphasizing fairness, accountability, and ethical leadership. Roosevelt's philosophy inspired generations of leaders to approach governance not merely as administration but as a tool for societal improvement. By the conclusion of Part 8, it was clear that Theodore Roosevelt had transformed American politics and society. Through the Square Deal, he demonstrated that principled leadership and proactive governance could create a more just, equitable, and prosperous nation. His reforms were not temporary measures. They were lasting changes that redefined the role of the presidency and the federal government. By the mid-1900s, Theodore Roosevelt had firmly established himself as a reformer and a transformative leader. His progressive policies reshaped America's economy, labor relations, and social fabric, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond his presidency. Expansion of progressive reforms. Roosevelt recognized that lasting change required more than individual legislation. It demanded a systematic transformation of government oversight. He expanded the reach of the federal government to regulate industries, protect workers, and ensure fair economic practices. Agencies and regulations were strengthened to prevent monopolistic abuse and safeguard public welfare. Labor and wage reforms during Roosevelt's final years in office. He continued to advocate for workers' rights. He promoted reasonable working hours, safer conditions, and fair wages across industries. His interventions in strikes and labor disputes showed a consistent philosophy. The government must mediate between capital and labor to maintain social stability and economic growth. These reforms not only improved the daily lives of millions of Americans, but also enhanced productivity and consumer confidence. Workers who were treated fairly were more motivated, and businesses that followed regulations contributed to a healthier and more sustainable economy. Trust-busting legacy. Roosevelt's relentless pursuit of corporate accountability created a blueprint for modern economic regulation. The dissolution of monopolies in industries like railroads, oil, and tobacco encouraged competition and innovation. Small and medium-sized enterprises flourished, leading to diversified markets and greater economic opportunity for citizens. By establishing a precedent for government intervention in the economy, Roosevelt ensured that wealth and power were balanced with fairness and justice, preventing the concentration of economic control that had threatened democracy. Economic modernization. Roosevelt's policies also emphasized the long-term stability and modernization of the American economy. By linking labor reforms, corporate oversight, and environmental conservation, he created a holistic system where economic growth was balanced with social responsibility and sustainability. This approach allowed America to expand industrially while protecting citizens, setting the stage for the economic prosperity of the early 20th century. Roosevelt's vision was not limited to immediate gains. He sought to transform the structural foundations of the nation's economy, creating policies that would endure well beyond his presidency. Public perception and enduring influence. By the end of his presidency, Roosevelt had earned the admiration of citizens across the political spectrum. He had shown that progressive reforms could coexist with economic strength, that the government could serve as a fair mediator, and that leadership demanded courage, vision, and moral clarity. His legacy during these years demonstrated a new model of presidential responsibility, one that intertwined domestic reform, economic modernization, and social justice. Roosevelt proved that a determined leader could reshape a nation's economic system, improve the lives of ordinary citizens, and ensure long-term prosperity. After completing 2 terms as president, Theodore Roosevelt could have retired quietly, content with his accomplishments. Yet, he remained deeply engaged in public life, determined to continue shaping the nation and influencing its future. Even outside the White House, Roosevelt's ideas and actions continued to impact America's political, economic, and social landscape. Post-presidency engagement. Roosevelt remained a vocal advocate for progressive reforms. He traveled extensively, delivering speeches on social justice, labor rights, and environmental conservation. His post-presidential activism demonstrated that leadership extended beyond official office. One could influence society through ideas, advocacy, and moral example. In 1912, Roosevelt returned to national politics with the Progressive Bull Moose Party, challenging the established political order. Though he did not win the presidency, his campaign pushed progressive policies to the forefront of American political debate, inspiring reforms in labor laws, corporate regulation, and environmental protection that would follow in later administrations. Economic influence. Roosevelt's impact on the American economy endured well beyond his presidency. The regulatory frameworks he established for corporations and monopolies continued to guide government oversight, ensuring fair competition and consumer protection. His vision of a balanced economy, where business thrived but citizens were protected, laid the foundation for modern American capitalism. Labor policies introduced or championed by Roosevelt inspired future legislation, including worker safety standards, minimum wages, and collective bargaining rights. These reforms improved the quality of life for millions, creating a more equitable and productive workforce, which in turn fueled long-term economic growth. Environmental legacy. Roosevelt's conservation efforts also had lasting effects. National parks, forests, and wildlife refuges preserved under his leadership became cornerstones of American identity. Tourism and sustainable resource management. His environmental vision demonstrated that protecting natural wealth was not only a moral duty but also an economic necessity, supporting industries, communities, and public health for decades to come. Enduring public image. Even after leaving office, Roosevelt remained a symbol of energy, courage, and moral leadership. Americans admired his commitment to fairness, his willingness to confront entrenched powers, and his proactive vision for the nation. His speeches, writings, and public appearances inspired citizens to believe in active engagement, social responsibility, and national progress. By the conclusion of Part 10, it was clear that Theodore Roosevelt's influence did not end with his presidency. His policies, ideas, and leadership style continued to shape America's political, economic, and social trajectory, leaving a legacy that endured well into the 20th century and beyond. Roosevelt had proven that one determined leader could transform a nation, not just for a term, but for generations. By the end of his life, Theodore Roosevelt had left an indelible mark on the United States. His presidency, post-presidency activism, and enduring philosophies had transformed America's economic, social, and political systems in ways that continue to resonate today. Cumulative economic impact. Roosevelt's aggressive regulation of monopolies, promotion of fair competition, and advocacy for labor rights fundamentally reshaped the American economy. Corporations were no longer untouchable. Workers had a voice. Consumers were protected. His progressive reforms laid the groundwork for modern regulatory agencies, including the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Labor, institutions that still influence corporate practices and labor standards today. By curbing corporate abuses and encouraging fair play, Roosevelt created a more equitable economic landscape. Small and medium-sized businesses thrived, innovation accelerated, and ordinary Americans gained greater opportunities for prosperity. His vision proved that economic strength and social justice were not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. Social and political legacy. Roosevelt's leadership inspired generations to view the presidency as an active instrument of change, rather than a ceremonial office. He demonstrated that the federal government could intervene decisively to protect the public interest, regulate private power, and foster opportunity for all citizens. His progressive philosophy, embodied in the Square Deal, reinforced the idea that social justice, economic fairness, and environmental stewardship were central to national strength. Roosevelt's approach influenced future reforms, from labor protections to social welfare policies, shaping the modern American political landscape. Environmental and conservation achievements. Roosevelt's environmental policies remain among his most enduring legacies. By creating national parks, monuments, and wildlife refuges, he preserved millions of acres of America's natural beauty for future generations. These efforts supported tourism, recreation, and economic development while instilling a cultural appreciation for nature. His conservation ethic set a precedent that long-term prosperity depends on sustainable management of natural resources. In this, Roosevelt demonstrated foresight unmatched in his era, blending environmental responsibility with economic strategy. Historical significance. Theodore Roosevelt's life and presidency illustrate how visionary leadership can reshape a nation. From his early struggles with health to his battlefield heroism, progressive reforms, and international diplomacy, Roosevelt exemplified resilience, courage, and moral clarity. His policies created a dynamic, fair, and sustainable society, influencing generations of Americans and cementing his place among the most transformative figures in U.S. history. Roosevelt showed that a single leader, guided by principle and action, can alter the course of a nation's economic, social, and political destiny. Conclusion. Theodore Roosevelt's legacy is multidimensional. He modernized the economy, empowered citizens, reformed government, and preserved the environment. His vision of a fair, responsible, and dynamic America continues to guide policymakers, inspire leaders, and shape the nation's trajectory. Roosevelt did not merely govern, he transformed the United States into a stronger, more just, and more resilient nation, leaving a lasting imprint that echoes through history. Even after his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt's ideas continued to shape the economic landscape of the United States. His reforms were not temporary fixes. They created lasting structures and principles that influenced the nation's financial, corporate, and labor systems for decades. Strengthening corporate oversight. Roosevelt's aggressive trust-busting efforts tackled some of the most powerful monopolies of his time. Companies that controlled essential industries, oil, railroads, steel, were forced to operate fairly and transparently. By doing so, Roosevelt ensured competition remained robust, preventing a concentration of economic power that could undermine democracy. The principle of corporate accountability he championed became a cornerstone of American capitalism. Today, modern antitrust laws, regulatory agencies, and corporate governance systems echo the standards he established. Roosevelt's approach proved that government intervention could correct market failures without stifling growth, setting a precedent for future presidents and legislators. Labor protections and wage reforms. Roosevelt firmly believed that a nation's economy was strongest when its workers were fairly treated and motivated. He intervened in strikes, enforced safer working conditions, and advocated for reasonable wages. By promoting labor fairness, Roosevelt reduced social unrest and increased productivity, creating a model for the balance between business interests and worker rights. These early labor reforms laid the groundwork for future legislation, including the Fair Labor Standards Act and industrial safety regulations, which continue to safeguard American workers. His belief in a balanced, just economy helped shape the social contract between employers, employees, and the government. Progressive taxation and economic equity. Roosevelt also emphasized economic equity. He recognized that wealth concentrated in the hands of a few could destabilize society. By advocating for progressive taxation, fair corporate practices, and oversight of monopolistic behavior, Roosevelt redistributed opportunities and encouraged a broader participation in the nation's prosperity. His vision was that economic growth should benefit all citizens, not just a privileged elite. This principle became a guiding force for later progressive reforms and social policies, influencing the structure of modern American economics. Long-term influence on modern capitalism. The cumulative effect of Roosevelt's policies was profound. By regulating corporations, protecting workers, and promoting fair competition, he created a resilient and balanced economic system. Modern American capitalism, with its combination of free markets, government oversight, and social responsibility owes much to the frameworks Roosevelt established. His reforms ensured that the U.S. economy could grow rapidly without succumbing to the abuses and inequalities that had plagued the Gilded Age. Roosevelt's vision was not limited to short-term gains. It was a holistic, sustainable approach that aligned economic strength with ethical governance and social welfare. Conclusion: Theodore Roosevelt's economic policies demonstrate how a determined leader can shape a nation's financial system, labor relations, and corporate practices for generations. His reforms balanced growth with fairness, efficiency with justice, and opportunity with responsibility. By the end of Part 12, it was clear that Roosevelt did not merely manage the economy, he transformed it, ensuring that America could prosper while remaining a fair and just society for all its citizens. Theodore Roosevelt's vision of America extended far beyond economics and politics. He believed that social reform and education were vital to the nation's long-term prosperity. Roosevelt understood that a strong economy alone could not sustain a healthy society. Its citizens also needed opportunity, knowledge, and moral guidance. Social reforms: Roosevelt championed fair treatment, social justice, and ethical governance as central principles of his administration. He sought to reduce inequalities caused by rapid industrialization and urbanization. Initiatives included housing and sanitation reforms to improve living conditions in rapidly growing cities, support for labor unions and worker protections to ensure safe and fair employment practices, consumer protection laws, including regulations on food and medicine, to safeguard public health. By advocating these measures, Roosevelt established the principle that government had a moral responsibility to protect its citizens, particularly the vulnerable and marginalized. Education initiatives: Roosevelt strongly believed in the power of education as a tool for social and economic advancement. He promoted public schools, libraries, and access to knowledge for all citizens, recognizing that an informed population was essential for a thriving democracy. Education, in Roosevelt's view, was not merely academic. It was preparation for life, instilling values of civic responsibility, critical thinking, and moral integrity. Through his policies and public advocacy, he encouraged Americans to pursue knowledge actively and to use it in service of the nation. Moral vision for America: at the core of Roosevelt's philosophy was a belief in the strenuous life, the idea that citizens should embrace challenges, take responsibility, and contribute actively to society. This principle extended to government, business, and daily life, promoting honesty, courage, and public service as fundamental values. Roosevelt's moral vision was reflected in his policies, which consistently sought justice, fairness, and long-term societal welfare. By linking ethics with governance, he transformed not only institutions but also the national culture, inspiring Americans to view themselves as active participants in shaping a better society. Impact on American society: through social reforms, educational advocacy, and moral leadership, Roosevelt laid the groundwork for a more equitable, knowledgeable, and responsible society. His approach demonstrated that progress depended not only on laws and policies but also on values, ethics, and civic engagement. By the end of Part 13, it was evident that Theodore Roosevelt's influence went far beyond politics and economics. He had shaped the moral and social fabric of the nation, leaving a legacy that would guide generations in governance, civic responsibility, and public service. While Roosevelt's domestic reforms reshaped America's economy and society, his foreign policy initiatives positioned the United States as a global power. He understood that a nation's strength was not only measured by its domestic prosperity but also by its influence abroad, its strategic alliances, and its ability to secure economic opportunities internationally. The Big stick diplomacy. Roosevelt famously adopted the principle of speak softly and carry a big stick. This approach emphasized diplomacy backed by military and economic strength, allowing the U.S. to negotiate from a position of power without unnecessary conflict. Roosevelt believed that national security, economic growth, and international respect were intertwined, and that a strong global presence could protect domestic interests. Panama Canal and global trade. One of Roosevelt's most significant achievements was the construction of the Panama Canal, a monumental engineering project that reshaped global commerce. By connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the canal reduced shipping time, lowered costs, and opened new trade routes. The canal's construction also demonstrated Roosevelt's ability to combine diplomacy, strategic vision, and economic foresight. He supported Panama's independence from Colombia to secure control over the canal zone, ensuring that the U.S. could manage and protect this critical trade route. The canal not only boosted the national economy but also solidified the U.S. as a key player in global commerce and geopolitics. Mediation and peace initiatives. Roosevelt also made history as a peacemaker. In 1905, he mediated the Russo-Japanese War, negotiating a treaty that ended hostilities and earned him the Nobel Peace Prize. By acting as a neutral mediator, Roosevelt prevented further conflict, strengthened international stability, and demonstrated that the United States could influence global affairs constructively. These diplomatic successes reinforced economic growth by ensuring safe trade routes, stable international markets, and secure political alliances. Roosevelt's foreign policy showed that global engagement was not just about power, but also about protecting and advancing national prosperity. Long-term economic and political effects. Roosevelt's international strategies had lasting impacts. They expanded U.S. influence in the Caribbean and Latin America, establishing economic and political footholds. They opened new markets for American goods, fostering domestic industrial growth. They set precedents for future presidents to balance diplomacy, military strength, and economic policy. By the end of Part 14, it was evident that Theodore Roosevelt had transformed the United States into a modern, economically powerful, and globally influential nation. His foreign policy initiatives were not isolated acts of diplomacy. They were integral to his vision of a strong, prosperous, and responsible America. Theodore Roosevelt's life and presidency offer a comprehensive lesson in leadership, vision, and action. His contributions spanned domestic reform, economic modernization, labor protections, conservation, and global diplomacy. By integrating these elements, Roosevelt created a holistic framework for national progress that continues to influence America today. Comprehensive legacy. Roosevelt's domestic and foreign policies were mutually reinforcing. His economic reforms, trust-busting, regulatory oversight, and labor protections ensured that America's industrial growth was sustainable and equitable. Social initiatives, including consumer protections, housing reforms, and education advocacy, strengthened the moral and social fabric of the nation. Meanwhile, his conservation policies preserved the environment while promoting economic opportunity through tourism, sustainable forestry, and natural resource management. These efforts reflected a long-term vision. America could thrive economically only if it respected both its citizens and its environment. Internationally, Roosevelt positioned the United States as a diplomatic and economic power. Through the construction of the Panama Canal, the Great White Fleet, and peace mediation efforts, he ensured that America could project influence globally while protecting domestic interests. Cultural influence beyond policies. Roosevelt's personality and philosophy left a lasting cultural imprint. He embodied the strenuous life, inspiring Americans to embrace challenges, act with courage, and engage actively in public life. His speeches, writings, and personal example encouraged citizens to value responsibility, resilience, and civic participation. Roosevelt also reshaped the public's perception of the presidency, demonstrating that leaders could be both principled and proactive, capable of addressing complex economic, social, and international issues with vision and integrity. Enduring lessons for modern America. Roosevelt's life offers enduring lessons for leaders and citizens alike. Active governance. The government can and should intervene to ensure fairness, justice, and sustainability. Balanced progress, economic growth, social justice, and environmental stewardship are interconnected. Moral leadership, courage, principle, and vision are essential for transformative change. Global perspective. Domestic prosperity is strengthened by thoughtful engagement in global affairs. By integrating these principles, Roosevelt created a blueprint for a modern, dynamic, and responsible nation. His reforms laid the foundation for contemporary American policies in labor rights, environmental protection, corporate regulation, and international diplomacy. Conclusion. By the end of Part 15, it becomes clear that Theodore Roosevelt did more than lead a nation, he transformed it. From the streets of New York to the global stage, his vision reshaped America's economy, society, governance, and international presence. Roosevelt's legacy is enduring: a fairer, stronger, and more resilient United States, guided by principle, courage, and foresight. His life reminds us that one determined leader, committed to justice, progress, and responsibility. After leaving the White House in 1909, Theodore Roosevelt did not fade into silence. Instead, he entered one of the most remarkable chapters of his life, a period defined by adventure, reflection, and renewed political purpose. For Roosevelt, retirement was not rest. It was simply a different form of action. Life after the presidency. Roosevelt immediately embarked on an extended journey across Africa and Europe. In Africa, he explored vast wildernesses, studied wildlife, and documented natural history with scientific precision. These journeys were not escapism. They reflected his lifelong belief in the strenuous life, the idea that a meaningful existence required effort, courage, and curiosity. As he traveled, Roosevelt observed the world closely. He studied governments, economies, and societies, comparing them with the United States. These experiences deepened his progressive beliefs, reinforcing his conviction that democracy must evolve to meet modern economic and social challenges. Growing discontent with American politics. While Roosevelt was abroad, American politics began to shift. His successor, William Howard Taft, adopted a more conservative approach, stepping away from many progressive reforms. Roosevelt grew increasingly concerned that the ideals of the Square Deal were being abandoned. By the time he returned to the United States, Roosevelt felt compelled to act again, not for personal power, but for what he believed was the moral direction of the nation. The 1912 election and the Bull Moose Party. In 1912, Roosevelt made an extraordinary decision. He would challenge the political establishment by running for president once more, this time as the leader of the Progressive Party, famously known as the Bull Moose Party. His platform was bold and ahead of its time. Stronger regulation of corporations, protection for workers and women, progressive taxation, social insurance and labor rights, direct democracy reforms. Roosevelt argued that government must evolve alongside society, or democracy itself would weaken under economic inequality and corporate dominance. During the campaign, Roosevelt survived an assassination attempt and still delivered a speech, an act that cemented his image as a symbol of unbreakable resolve. Though he did not win the election, his campaign reshaped American political discourse. Long-term impact of the 1912 campaign. Even in defeat, Roosevelt achieved something profound. His ideas forced both major parties to adopt progressive reforms in the years that followed. Policies he championed would later influence labor protections, social welfare systems, regulatory agencies, democratic participation reforms. The Bull Moose campaign proved that ideas can be more powerful than elections. Final years and reflection. In his final years, Roosevelt's health declined, but his influence did not. He continued to write, speak, and inspire. His life became a symbol of moral courage, intellectual curiosity, and relentless service. Roosevelt passed away in 1919, but by then, his legacy was deeply embedded in the American system. The government he helped shape, active, responsible, and reform-oriented, continued to guide the nation through the challenges of the modern world. Closing reflection. Part 16 reveals Theodore Roosevelt not as a man who stepped away from power, but as one who never stepped away from principle. Even after the presidency, even after defeat, he continued to shape America, not through authority, but through ideas, example, and courage. His life reminds us that true leadership is not defined by office, but by impact. As Theodore Roosevelt's life quietly moved toward its final chapter, the noise of politics faded, but the echo of his ideas remained. He no longer stood on campaign stages or addressed roaring crowds. Instead, his presence lived on in laws, institutions, forests, workers' rights, and the everyday lives of millions who would never know his name, but would benefit from his work. Roosevelt spent his final years in reflection. He wrote letters, essays, and books, thinking deeply about history, morality, leadership, and responsibility. He believed that the true measure of a life was not comfort, wealth, or power, but contribution. In quiet moments, Roosevelt reflected on America itself. A nation once dominated by unchecked corporations had begun to find balance. Workers had gained dignity. Consumers were safer. Natural lands were protected. The presidency itself had transformed, from a passive role into an active guardian of the public good. These changes did not happen overnight. They unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, like roots growing beneath the soil. And yet, those roots were strong. Roosevelt's belief in the strenuous life was never about exhaustion or constant struggle. In his later years, it became something softer, deeper, a belief that each generation must do its part, then step back and allow the next to continue the work. When Theodore Roosevelt passed away in January of 1919, the nation did not collapse. The world did not stop. And that, perhaps, was his greatest achievement. He had helped build systems that did not depend on one man. Forests still stood. Laws still protected. Institutions still functioned. His absence revealed the strength of what he had created. Today, when a worker enjoys safer conditions, when a consumer trusts the food they eat, when a family walks through a national park, when a government dares to challenge powerful interests, they are unknowingly walking along a path Theodore Roosevelt helped clear. History often remembers loud moments, wars, speeches, elections. But real transformation happens quietly, over time, in rules, habits, and values that shape daily life. Roosevelt understood this. He did not seek to be remembered as a hero. He sought to leave behind a functioning, fair, and resilient nation. As this story comes to an end, there is no dramatic conclusion. No final battle. No final speech. Only the calm understanding that one life, lived with purpose, can ripple across generations. And now, as the story slows, as the words grow softer, as the mind begins to rest, you can let the history fade gently into silence. Because the work was done, the path was set, and the night is quiet. After Theodore Roosevelt passed away in 1919, America did not pause to reflect. History rarely does. Life continued, quietly, steadily, guided by systems, laws, and habits that had slowly taken shape during his lifetime. Factories opened each morning. Workers gathered at gates. Trains ran on regulated lines. Food was inspected. Forests remained protected. None of this carried his name. And yet, all of it carried his influence. Roosevelt had never believed that a nation should depend on one man. In fact, one of his deepest convictions was that true leadership makes itself unnecessary over time. He wanted institutions strong enough to function without constant heroism. In the decades that followed, America faced wars, depressions, and transformations Roosevelt could never have predicted. But when crises came, the country did not face them empty-handed. It had regulatory frameworks. It had a tradition of government responsibility. It had the expectation that power, whether political or economic, must answer to the public. These expectations did not appear suddenly. They had been practiced. Slowly, imperfectly, but consistently. Roosevelt's vision of a balanced nation, where business could grow, but not dominate, where labor had dignity, where nature had value, became part of the American mindset. Not always followed, not always respected, but never fully forgotten. In quiet ways, his ideas shaped how later leaders thought about fairness, responsibility, and the role of government. And in quieter ways still, they shaped how ordinary people lived their lives, often without knowing why certain protections existed, or how close the country once came to losing balance. As years passed, Roosevelt became a historical figure. A statue, a chapter, a name remembered differently by different people. But history does not measure impact by memory. It measures impact by continuity. By the fact that the system still stands when the voice that built it is gone. Roosevelt had lived intensely, but his greatest contribution was calm. A calm that allowed others to live, work, and rest without chaos. And as the story moves forward, without urgency, without drama, it becomes clear that his life was not about domination or glory. It was about direction. In the years after Theodore Roosevelt's death, America entered a period of rapid change. The world was moving faster than ever before. Technology advanced. Industries expanded. Global conflicts reshaped nations. Yet beneath all this movement, the structures Roosevelt helped build continued to guide the country. Presidents who came after him faced new challenges: economic crashes, labor unrest, and international tensions. But when they searched for solutions, they often returned to ideas Roosevelt had normalized: that government could intervene, that unchecked power was dangerous, and that fairness was not weakness. During economic crises, Roosevelt's philosophy of balanced capitalism resurfaced. Regulation was no longer seen as radical. Labor protections were no longer unthinkable. These concepts had become part of America's political language. Even leaders who disagreed with Roosevelt still operated within the system he shaped. Corporations expected oversight. Workers expected rights. Citizens expected responsibility from leadership. This was Roosevelt's quiet victory. He had changed expectations. America was no longer a nation where power operated freely without accountability. It was now a country where public interest had a voice, even when that voice was challenged. Roosevelt had once believed that democracy must be protected not just from foreign threats, but from internal imbalance. Time proved him right. His influence did not appear as monuments or slogans. It appeared in decisions made during moments of pressure, when leaders chose regulation over chaos, responsibility over profit, and long-term stability over short-term gain. By the time the modern United States fully emerged, Theodore Roosevelt's role in shaping it was already part of history. But history does not diminish importance. It confirms it. Roosevelt had redefined what leadership meant in a modern nation. He showed that strength could be moral, not just physical. That power could be restrained, not feared. That government could serve the people without controlling them. His legacy lived on in laws, institutions, and expectations, but also in attitude. The attitude that leadership demands courage. That progress requires responsibility. That prosperity must be shared to endure. Roosevelt did not create a perfect system. No leader ever does. But he created a flexible one, capable of correcting itself, adapting, and responding to change. That may be his greatest achievement. When historians look back, they do not see Theodore Roosevelt as a man of one moment. They see him as a bridge between an unregulated past and a balanced future. A leader who understood that true success is not domination, but direction. And with that understanding, the story of Theodore Roosevelt reaches its natural conclusion. Not with drama, not with final words, but with continuity. Because the nation he helped shape continued forward, long after his voice fell silent. After Theodore Roosevelt, America was no longer an experiment. It had become a system. A system where power was watched, where wealth was questioned, and where leadership carried moral weight. The country continued to grow. Industries expanded, cities rose higher, and America's influence spread across the world. But growth now followed rules. Those rules did not come naturally. They were learned through struggle, conflict, and reform, many of which Roosevelt had faced first. Future presidents did not always mention his name, but they followed his path. When monopolies grew too powerful, the question was no longer if the government should act, but how. When workers demanded fairness, the debate was no longer whether they deserved rights, but how to protect them. This shift in mindset mattered more than any single law. Roosevelt had changed how Americans thought about authority. Government was no longer seen only as a distant force. It became a referee, sometimes imperfect, sometimes slow, but necessary. Internationally, America adopted a more confident posture. Not reckless, not silent, measured. Roosevelt's belief that a nation must be strong yet restrained echoed through diplomacy, defense, and global negotiations. The United States stepped onto the world stage not as an empire, but as a power with responsibility. That balance, strength without tyranny, was fragile. But it existed. And it existed because someone had first dared to define it. As time moved forward, Theodore Roosevelt slowly transformed from a living figure into a historical presence. But history did not reduce him. It clarified him. When nations evolve, they carry invisible fingerprints of those who shaped their direction. Roosevelt's fingerprints remained everywhere, quiet, unspoken, but deeply embedded. America did not become calmer after him. It did not become simpler. In many ways, it became more complex. New technologies arrived. New social struggles emerged. New global responsibilities formed. Yet when these challenges appeared, the foundations Roosevelt had strengthened continued to support the nation. He had believed that leadership required presence, not distance. That power demanded restraint, not surrender. That democracy was not self-sustaining, it had to be protected through action. These beliefs aged well. In moments of crisis, leaders often returned to ideas Roosevelt once defended. That markets must serve society, that wealth must carry responsibility, and that government must act when imbalance threatens stability. Roosevelt never believed in perfection. He believed in effort. He accepted conflict as the cost of progress. He accepted criticism as the price of leadership. He accepted that history would judge him, but he acted anyway. That willingness to act became his greatest lesson. Over time, Americans stopped arguing whether government should protect the public interest. The debate shifted toward how best to do it. That shift changed everything. Roosevelt had moved the national conversation forward, permanently. Even when his policies were adjusted, softened, or challenged, they were never erased. They became reference points, benchmarks, standards against which future decisions were measured. In foreign policy, his philosophy endured as well. He believed that strength must exist to preserve peace, but that force without wisdom leads to collapse. America adopted this balance unevenly, sometimes imperfectly, but the principle remained. Strength with responsibility. Authority with restraint. As decades passed, Roosevelt's image settled into textbooks, speeches, and documentaries. But his influence remained active, felt in laws, institutions, and expectations. People no longer remembered the America before him clearly. And that was his quiet triumph. He had altered the nation's trajectory so completely that his changes felt natural, normal, necessary. Theodore Roosevelt did not ask history to be kind to him. He asked it to be honest. And honesty reveals this: he was not merely a president of his time. He was an architect of transition. He helped America move from raw power to regulated strength, from unchecked ambition to guided growth, from individual dominance to collective responsibility. He did not finish the work. He never intended to. He believed progress was ongoing, that each generation must carry the responsibility forward. And they did. Today, when discussions arise about fairness, authority, leadership, or reform, Roosevelt's philosophy still echoes beneath the surface. Not loudly, not forcefully, but steadily, like a deep current beneath calm water. And so the story of Theodore Roosevelt ends not with an ending, but with continuation. A nation still shaped by the courage of one man who believed that leadership was not about control, but about care. By the early 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt had already become one of the most transformative figures in American history. Born in 1858 into a wealthy New York family, Roosevelt overcame childhood illnesses and physical frailty to pursue a life defined by courage, intellect, and relentless energy. His vision for America combined progressive reform, social responsibility, environmental stewardship, and global diplomacy, creating a legacy that shaped the nation for generations. Roosevelt's philosophy of the strenuous life became a guiding principle not only for himself but for the country. He believed that a nation must confront challenges with courage, harness its resources wisely, and ensure that growth and progress benefited all citizens. Domestic reforms. Economic transformation. Roosevelt assumed the presidency at a time when industrialization had created vast wealth and concentrated power in the hands of a few monopolistic corporations. The rapid economic expansion brought innovation and prosperity, but it also caused inequality, worker exploitation, and social unrest. 1. Trust-busting and corporate oversight. Roosevelt's commitment to regulating corporate power became a hallmark of his presidency. Using the Sherman Antitrust Act, he challenged major monopolies, particularly in railroads, oil, and tobacco. His administration initiated lawsuits that dismantled unfair corporate practices, promoting competition and curbing the concentration of economic power. The trust-busting efforts had lasting impacts. Small and medium-sized businesses thrived, contributing to economic diversification. Consumer protections improved, ensuring fair prices and better product quality. Government authority over the economy was strengthened, creating a precedent for future regulatory frameworks. 2. Labor rights and worker protections. Roosevelt understood that economic growth must be paired with social fairness. Industrial workers often faced dangerous conditions, long hours, and low wages. Roosevelt intervened in strikes, including the coal strike of 1902, negotiating fair wages and improved working conditions. This marked a pivotal shift. The federal government as an arbiter between labor and capital, ensuring stability and fairness. 3. Progressive taxation and fair economic policies. Roosevelt also advocated for progressive taxation, ensuring that wealth distribution was balanced to support public welfare and reduce inequality. By doing so, he created a framework for sustainable economic growth that encouraged both innovation and social responsibility. Environmental conservation. Roosevelt recognized that America's natural resources were finite and critical for long-term prosperity. He championed conservation policies unprecedented in American history. 1. National parks and forests. Roosevelt established over 150 national forests, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments, protecting millions of acres of land. These initiatives ensured the preservation of forests, rivers, and wildlife, while also promoting recreation and tourism, supporting economic growth in local communities. 2. Sustainable resource management. Through the United States Forest Service, led by Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt implemented sustainable forestry practices, balancing resource use with conservation. Timber, water, and wildlife resources were managed to support both economic needs and environmental preservation. 3. Wildlife protection. Roosevelt established policies to prevent overhunting and protect endangered species, demonstrating that ecological health was inseparable from economic stability and national well-being. Foreign policy and global influence. Roosevelt's vision extended beyond domestic affairs. He understood that America's strength and prosperity depended on its international position. 1. Big stick diplomacy. Roosevelt's foreign policy mantra, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," reflected a pragmatic approach to international affairs. Diplomacy was supported by a credible display of power, ensuring that America could protect its interests while maintaining global stability. 2. Panama Canal. One of Roosevelt's signature achievements was the construction of the Panama Canal, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This strategic waterway transformed global trade, reduced shipping time, and secured America's economic and military advantage. By supporting Panama's independence from Colombia, Roosevelt ensured U.S. control and oversight of this critical route, demonstrating strategic foresight. 3. Mediation and peace initiatives. Roosevelt mediated the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, earning the Nobel Peace Prize. His mediation prevented further conflict and reinforced America's role as a constructive global power, balancing diplomacy with strategic interests. 4. Expansion of U.S. influence. Through initiatives such as the Great White Fleet, Roosevelt projected American power globally, strengthened trade relations, and positioned the United States as an emerging world leader. Cultural and moral leadership beyond policy. Roosevelt's personal ethos shaped American culture. The strenuous life encouraged citizens to embrace challenges, participate actively in civic life, and cultivate resilience. He redefined the presidency as a proactive, morally guided office capable of addressing social, economic, and international challenges. His speeches, writings, and actions inspired Americans to value courage, responsibility, and public service. Post-presidency, a continuing influence after leaving the White House in 1909. Theodore Roosevelt could have chosen a quiet retirement. Instead, he remained actively engaged in politics, public discourse, and social reform. His post-presidential years demonstrated that leadership and influence extended beyond holding office. Roosevelt traveled extensively, delivering speeches that emphasized progressive reform, social responsibility, and civic engagement. He reminded Americans that democracy required active participation and that both citizens and leaders had a duty to confront societal challenges. The 1912 election and the Progressive Party in 1912, Roosevelt returned to the political arena with the Progressive Bull Moose Party, challenging incumbent William Howard Taft. Although he did not win, the campaign was historically significant for several reasons. Advancing progressive policies. Roosevelt's platform pushed for labor rights, women's suffrage, social welfare programs, and corporate regulation, forcing mainstream parties to address these issues. His campaign expanded the public's expectations of government responsibility. Direct democracy and citizen engagement. Roosevelt emphasized the importance of citizens' voices in shaping policy. He actively campaigned across the nation, meeting ordinary Americans and encouraging civic participation. This approach solidified his reputation as a president for the people, not just for elites. Impact on American politics, even in defeat. The Progressive Party reshaped political discourse, influencing future reforms and cementing Roosevelt's legacy as a visionary leader who prioritized principle over partisanship. Expansion of conservation efforts. Roosevelt's conservation initiatives continued even after his presidency. National parks and monuments. He expanded existing parks and established new ones, preserving millions of acres of forests, mountains, and coastlines. These efforts safeguarded natural habitats while promoting recreation and tourism. Sustainable resource management. Roosevelt's post-presidential advocacy emphasized long-term environmental planning, ensuring that forests, rivers, and wildlife remained productive and protected. Global influence of conservation. His vision inspired international leaders to consider sustainable resource management, positioning the U.S. as a pioneer in conservation. Labor and social reforms continued. Roosevelt remained a vocal advocate for workers' rights and social justice. He supported strikes and labor negotiations, advocating for fair wages and safe working conditions. Roosevelt emphasized that economic prosperity must benefit all citizens, not just corporate elites. His post-presidential efforts reinforced the principles of the Square Deal, laying groundwork for future labor protections and social welfare programs. Cultural and moral influence. Roosevelt's personal philosophy continued to inspire Americans after his presidency. The strenuous life. Roosevelt promoted active citizenship, courage, and perseverance. He believed that individual effort and moral responsibility were essential for national progress. Ethics in leadership. Through speeches, books, and public appearances, he emphasized honesty, accountability, and integrity, reshaping public expectations of government and leadership. Influence on future generations. Roosevelt's emphasis on civic duty and national service inspired future leaders, educators, and reformers. His moral framework became a guiding principle for progressive movements and social activism throughout the 20th century. International diplomacy and global legacy. Even post-presidency, Roosevelt remained influential on the world stage. He advised on foreign policy, advocating for peaceful negotiation backed by strategic strength. Roosevelt's policies and principles regarding trade, defense, and international arbitration cemented the U.S. as a credible global power. His legacy influenced international law, diplomacy, and the U.S.'s approach to global economic leadership. Comprehensive legacy. By the end of Part 23b, it is clear that Theodore Roosevelt's impact was multidimensional and enduring. Economic reform, trust busting, labor protections, progressive taxation, environmental leadership, national parks, sustainable resource management, wildlife protection, social progress, education, consumer protection, housing and public health reforms, global influence, Panama Canal, peace mediation, big stick diplomacy, cultural impact, civic engagement, moral leadership, and the philosophy of the strenuous life. Roosevelt's life demonstrates that one committed leader can transform a nation's economy, society, governance, and global presence, leaving a legacy that continues to guide policy, inspire citizens, and shape national identity. Conclusion. Enduring lessons. Theodore Roosevelt's story offers timeless lessons. Leadership requires courage, vision, and moral clarity. Government must serve citizens, balance power, and promote fairness. Sustainable growth depends on integrating social, economic, and environmental priorities. Active civic engagement strengthens democracy and ensures national progress. Roosevelt's influence transcends time, from domestic reforms to global diplomacy. His principles continue to guide policymakers, inspire citizens, and shape the United States as a fairer, stronger, and more resilient nation. After Theodore Roosevelt left active political life, the systems he helped reshape did not slow down. They expanded. America moved deeper into the 20th century, carrying structures that had been fragile before Roosevelt, and solid afterward. This part of the story is not about one man acting. It is about a country functioning differently because he once acted. 1. The economic system after Roosevelt. Before Roosevelt, the American economy was driven almost entirely by private power. Large corporations dictated prices. Workers had little protection. Government intervention was rare and often feared. After Roosevelt, the economic system began operating under assumptions he introduced. Corporate regulation became normal. Trust busting did not end with Roosevelt, but it became standard policy. Later administrations used antitrust laws not as emergency tools, but as routine mechanisms. Railroads, oil companies, steel industries, and financial institutions now expected oversight. This expectation changed behavior. Corporations began planning growth within regulatory boundaries, not outside them. That shift stabilized markets and reduced extreme economic volatility. Labor as a recognized stakeholder. Roosevelt's intervention in labor disputes created a precedent. Workers were no longer invisible. Unions gained legitimacy. Workplace safety laws expanded. Wages and working hours became political concerns. By the mid-20th century, labor rights were no longer controversial, they were institutional. This stabilized society and reduced class-based unrest. 2. Political power. A stronger presidency. Roosevelt permanently changed the presidency. Before him, presidents mostly reacted to Congress. After him, presidents initiated national direction. Future presidents inherited executive authority, public expectation of action, responsibility during crisis. Even presidents who disagreed with Roosevelt's ideology used the tools he normalized. Emergency powers. Executive orders. Public leadership during conflict. The office itself had evolved. 3. The Square Deal as a permanent framework. Roosevelt's Square Deal was not a single policy. It was a governing philosophy. Fairness for workers, fairness for consumers, fairness for business. This framework became embedded in American governance. Later programs, New Deal, Fair Deal, Great Society, expanded this idea, not replaced it. The belief that government must balance competing interests became central. This prevented extreme swings toward either unchecked capitalism or total state control. 4. Conservation as national infrastructure. Roosevelt's conservation policies reshaped how America viewed land. Land was no longer just property. It was national infrastructure. Forests protected water systems. Parks supported public health. Wildlife preservation maintained ecological balance. As population grew, these protected areas prevented environmental collapse. Later environmental laws were built on Roosevelt's foundation, not invented separately. Without his early intervention, much of America's natural system would have been irreversibly damaged. 5. Military and global strategy. Roosevelt believed America must be prepared, but not reckless. His modernization of the Navy created long-term strategic advantage. By World War II, the U.S. military structure reflected Roosevelt's early reforms: global mobility, strategic presence, deterrence-based power. The Panama Canal continued to shape trade and defense logistics for decades. This infrastructure advantage positioned America as a global power long after Roosevelt's death. 6. Democracy and public trust. One of Roosevelt's most lasting achievements was restoring public trust. Before him, many Americans believed government served only the wealthy. After him, citizens expected government to intervene when systems failed. This trust allowed democracy to survive economic depression, war, and social change. Even criticism of government operated within the expectation of responsibility. That expectation kept the system stable. 7. Cultural shift. The citizen's role. Roosevelt emphasized active citizenship. Voting, public debate, civic duty. Americans began to see themselves not just as individuals, but participants. This culture supported education reform, public health initiatives, national service movements. Democracy became participatory, not passive. 8. Mistakes, limits, and criticism. Roosevelt was not flawless. Some policies favored American expansion unfairly. Some decisions prioritized power over diplomacy. Some reforms excluded marginalized groups. But the system he built was self-correcting. That mattered more than perfection. America could revise, reform, and adjust because Roosevelt had strengthened institutions. 9. Measuring Roosevelt's impact objectively. When historians evaluate Roosevelt, they focus on outcomes. Reduced corporate dominance, stabilized labor relations, protected natural resources, expanded executive leadership, increased global influence. Few presidents altered so many systems simultaneously. Fewer still altered them permanently. 10. Why Roosevelt still matters. Roosevelt matters because modern capitalism depends on regulation, modern democracy depends on action, modern leadership depends on responsibility. These principles remain relevant. They continue to shape policy debates, economic planning, and public expectations. By the time America entered the middle of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt was no longer discussed as a recent leader. He was discussed as a reference point. Political debates, economic planning, and social reforms often began with an unspoken assumption: the system must be managed, not abandoned. That assumption did not exist before Roosevelt. 1. The economic system enters the modern age. As America industrialized further, Roosevelt's economic framework became increasingly relevant. Corporations grew larger. Financial systems became more complex. Global trade expanded rapidly. Without regulation, this complexity could have led to collapse. Roosevelt's legacy ensured that rules expanded alongside markets. Banking regulations, competition laws, consumer protections, these mechanisms did not slow capitalism. They prevented it from destroying itself. By the mid-1900s, American capitalism functioned differently from earlier empires. It was aggressive, but monitored; innovative, but constrained; powerful, but accountable. This balance made long-term growth possible. 2. Crisis response as a national habit. One of Roosevelt's most enduring contributions was how America responded to crisis. Before him, crises were often ignored until collapse occurred. After him, intervention became expected. Economic recessions, labor strikes, public health emergencies in each case. The question shifted from, should government act, to, how should it act? This mindset saved the nation multiple times. During depressions, wars, and social upheavals, decisive leadership prevented systemic breakdown. That expectation of response traces directly back to Roosevelt's presidency. 3. Expansion of federal responsibility. Roosevelt expanded not just power, but responsibility. The federal government became accountable for economic stability, worker safety, environmental protection, fair competition. This responsibility did not disappear with changing administrations. Even when political ideology shifted, the baseline responsibility remained. That continuity gave the American system resilience. 4. Environmental policy becomes strategic as population growth increased pressure on land and resources. Roosevelt's conservation framework proved essential. Protected forests regulated water systems. National parks preserved biodiversity. Public land reduced overexploitation. These were not symbolic gestures. They were strategic decisions. Later environmental crises were mitigated because Roosevelt had acted early. Countries without such foresight suffered irreversible damage. America avoided the worst outcomes, not by accident, but by planning. 5. Military power with civilian control. Roosevelt believed in strength, but not militarism. This distinction shaped American defense policy. Civilian oversight, strategic preparedness, limited engagement. These principles guided military planning throughout the 20th century. Even during global conflicts, leadership aimed to balance force with diplomacy. Though not always successful, the structure existed. That structure originated under Roosevelt. 6. Democracy under pressure. Modern democracy faced challenges Roosevelt never fully imagined: mass media, corporate lobbying, globalized economies. Yet the institutions he strengthened adapted. Regulatory agencies evolved. Public accountability mechanisms expanded. Judicial oversight matured. The system bent, but did not break. This adaptability was Roosevelt's greatest contribution. 7. Social expectations and citizenship. Roosevelt reshaped what citizens expected from leadership. People no longer accepted silence during injustice. They demanded response. This expectation fueled civil rights movements, labor reform, consumer advocacy, environmental activism. Citizenship became active. Democracy became participatory. 8. Roosevelt's limits become lessons. History did not idealize Roosevelt. His flaws became lessons. Power requires humility. Reform requires inclusion. Leadership requires listening. Later leaders adjusted policies where Roosevelt fell short. That correction process was possible because the system allowed reform. 9. Comparing Roosevelt to other leaders. Few leaders reshaped so many systems simultaneously: economy, government, environment, foreign policy. Others built on his work. Few replaced it. Roosevelt was not the end of an era. He was the beginning of a structure. 10. Why Roosevelt still shapes the future. Every modern debate touches Roosevelt's legacy. Regulation versus freedom, growth versus sustainability, power versus responsibility. These debates exist within the framework he created. As the 20th century advanced, The systems Theodore Roosevelt helped establish began facing pressures he had anticipated, but never fully experienced. Economic shocks, global wars, social upheaval. The question was no longer whether Roosevelt's framework worked. The question became whether it could survive stress. 1. The Great Depression. A system tested. The Great Depression challenged every assumption about capitalism. Banks collapsed. Markets failed. Millions lost their livelihoods. Yet the response followed a familiar logic. Government intervention. This was not a sudden invention. It was an extension of Roosevelt's philosophy. Regulation expanded. Public works stabilized employment. Financial systems were restructured. The framework held. America did not abandon capitalism. It corrected it. 2. War economy and federal coordination. World War II required massive coordination. Industry, labor, and government worked as a single system. Such coordination would have been impossible before Roosevelt. Antitrust rules adjusted. Production centralized. Labor protections maintained. The balance between power and oversight remained. Roosevelt's system adapted without collapsing. 3. Post-war growth and middle-class expansion. After the war, America entered a period of rapid growth. Factories expanded. Infrastructure developed. Education increased. This growth was not chaotic. It was regulated. Labor protections ensured stability. Economic planning encouraged investment. Public trust remained intact. The middle class expanded, something rare in unregulated economies. 4. Environmental pressure increases. Industrial growth strained natural resources. Yet the conservation framework endured. Protected lands absorbed pressure. Environmental agencies evolved. Long-term planning became necessary. Roosevelt's early conservation decisions delayed irreversible damage. Without them, recovery would have been impossible. 5. Political polarization emerges as society grew more complex. Political disagreement intensified. Different ideologies competed. But they competed within the same system. Regulation was debated, not rejected. Government power was argued over, not erased. This continuity prevented institutional collapse. 6. Corporate power returns. Underwatch corporations regained influence over time, but never absolute control. Antitrust law remained. Public scrutiny increased. Judicial oversight expanded. Power concentrated, but never unchecked. That distinction mattered. 7. Public expectations remain high. Citizens continued to expect action. During economic downturns. During environmental crises. During social conflict. This expectation forced leadership to respond. Silence was no longer acceptable. That cultural shift began under Roosevelt. 8. Mistakes without breakdown. Not every policy succeeded. Some interventions failed. Some regulations were misused. But the system corrected itself. Failure did not equal collapse. That resilience was Roosevelt's gift. 9. Long-term comparison. Nations without similar frameworks experienced repeated financial collapse, political instability, environmental degradation. America avoided the worst outcomes, not through perfection, but through structure. 10. Why the system still matters. The pressures continue. Globalization, technology, climate change. Yet the core framework remains relevant. Balance, oversight, responsibility. By the late 20th century, the United States was operating in a world Theodore Roosevelt could never have fully imagined. The pace of life had accelerated. Technology reshaped communication, finance, and warfare. Economic power crossed borders instantly. Yet the structure Roosevelt helped build was still in use. This part of the story is not about Roosevelt himself. It is about how his system behaved when history applied pressure again and again. 1. From industrial economy to financial economy, Roosevelt governed during an industrial age. Factories, railroads, steel, oil. But by the late 20th century, America shifted toward a financial and service-based economy. Banks became larger than factories. Markets moved faster than trains ever did. Decisions were made in seconds, not years. This shift created new risks. Speculation increased. Debt expanded. Economic bubbles formed. The question was clear. Could Roosevelt's regulatory philosophy survive an economy no longer based on physical production? The answer was yes, because the philosophy was never about factories. It was about power concentration. 2. Regulation evolves, not disappears. As industries changed, regulation followed. New agencies emerged. Old laws were updated. Oversight became more technical. Antitrust law adapted to mergers and acquisitions. Financial regulations targeted banking and investment risk. Consumer protection extended to credit, insurance, and digital markets. This continuity mattered. Other nations removed regulation during similar transitions, and paid the price. America did not eliminate oversight. It adjusted it. That adjustment preserved stability. 3. Financial crashes and government response. Despite regulation, financial crises still occurred. Markets overheated. Speculation grew. Confidence collapsed. Each time, the response followed a familiar logic. Stabilize the system. Protect the public. Reform afterward. This approach was not accidental. It reflected Roosevelt's belief that inaction during crisis is itself a decision, and usually the wrong one. During financial emergencies, government intervention prevented full collapse. Criticism followed. Debate intensified. But the system survived. Roosevelt had normalized the idea that government exists to prevent total failure, not to watch it happen. 4. Corporate power. In the modern era, corporate power returned, stronger, faster, and more global. Multinational corporations influenced supply chains, employment, and policy. The risk Roosevelt warned about resurfaced, private power becoming public authority. The response was not perfect, but it existed. Antitrust cases continued. Regulatory oversight expanded. Public scrutiny increased. Corporations operated with influence, but not immunity. That distinction preserved democracy. 5. Executive authority. In a fast world, modern presidents faced crises at unprecedented speed. Economic crashes unfolded in hours. Security threats emerged instantly. Public health emergencies spread globally. The expectation of executive action remained firm. Presidents were expected to act, not observe. That expectation originated under Roosevelt. He transformed the presidency from a reactive office into a command center during instability. Later presidents inherited this responsibility. Sometimes they used it well, sometimes poorly, but the authority itself was never questioned. 6. War, defense, and strategic balance. Military technology evolved rapidly. Nuclear weapons, global alliances, asymmetric warfare. Yet civilian control over the military remained intact. Roosevelt's emphasis on preparedness without militarism shaped this balance. America maintained strength, without surrendering democracy. This balance prevented military dominance over civil government. Few nations achieved this successfully. 7. Environmental stress reaches a new level by the late 20th century. Environmental strain became undeniable. Pollution increased. Climate concerns emerged. Resource depletion accelerated. Roosevelt's conservation system evolved into environmental regulation. Protected land provided buffers. Agencies expanded oversight. Long-term planning became essential. Without Roosevelt's early intervention, later correction would have been impossible. Conservation delayed irreversible damage long enough for policy to catch up. 8. Public trust under pressure. Public trust fluctuated. Scandals occurred. Mistakes were exposed. Institutions were criticized. But trust did not vanish entirely. Why? Because the system allowed accountability. Investigations happened. Courts functioned. Leadership changed. Roosevelt's insistence on transparency and responsibility created expectations that protected democracy from collapse. 9. Social movements within structure. Social change accelerated. Civil rights movements, labor advocacy, consumer protection, environmental activism. These movements succeeded because the system could absorb pressure. Change occurred through institutions, not chaos. That flexibility came from Roosevelt's reforms. 10. Globalization and national control. Globalization reduced national control over markets. But Roosevelt's framework adapted. Trade agreements included safeguards. Regulation addressed cross-border activity. National interest remained a guiding principle. America engaged globally without abandoning internal stability. That balance was rare. 11. Mistakes that did not destroy the system. Policies failed. Regulations lagged behind technology. Decisions produced unintended consequences. But the system corrected itself. Failures became reforms, not collapse. This capacity for correction defined Roosevelt's success. 12. Comparing systems. Worldwide nations without similar structures experienced repeated economic collapse, authoritarian drift, environmental ruin. America avoided the worst outcomes, not through perfection, through structure. 13. Why Roosevelt's philosophy endured. Roosevelt's system survived because it was based on principles, not rigid rules. Accountability, balance, responsibility, action. These principles adapt across generations. When people think about Theodore Roosevelt, they often imagine dramatic moments, the Rough Riders, the speeches, the confrontations with powerful trusts. But the true measure of his impact was never loud. It was quiet. By the late 20th and early 21st century, Roosevelt's influence no longer appeared as action. It appeared as normal life. People did not notice it. They lived inside it. 1. When systems become invisible, a successful system eventually disappears from attention. Roads that do not collapse. Banks that open every morning. Food that is safe to eat. Land that remains protected. None of these feel dramatic. But each exists because someone once decided chaos was unacceptable. Roosevelt's greatest achievement was not reform itself. It was making reform permanent enough to feel ordinary. 2. The consumer's daily protection. By the time modern Americans shopped in grocery stores, pharmacies, or online marketplaces, safety was assumed. Food labels existed. Ingredients were regulated. Fraud was punishable. This was not accidental. Before Roosevelt's era, consumers had little protection. Dangerous products circulated freely. False claims were common. Health risks were ignored. Roosevelt changed the relationship between citizens and markets. He made safety a government responsibility. By Part 28's era, this responsibility had expanded quietly into every household. 3. Work without constant fear. Workplaces evolved. Factories were safer. Hours were regulated. Child labor declined. Workers could complain without immediate retaliation. These protections were not perfect. They were incomplete. They were often challenged. But they existed. Before Roosevelt, labor protections were considered interference. After Roosevelt, they were considered expectation. That shift permanently changed how Americans experienced work. 4. The middle class as a system outcome. The American middle class did not emerge by accident. It emerged because markets were restrained enough to allow stability. Roosevelt did not invent the middle class, but he created conditions where it could grow. Regulated competition prevented monopolies from crushing wages. Consumer protections reduced exploitation. Public investment supported infrastructure. Over decades, this produced something rare in history: a large population living without extreme wealth or extreme poverty. This balance was fragile, but real. 5. Crisis without collapse. When crisis struck, economic, political, or environmental, Americans expected response. They expected action. This expectation did not exist before Roosevelt. Previously, government hesitation was normal. Roosevelt reversed that logic. By the time of later crises, inaction felt irresponsible. This cultural shift saved the system repeatedly. 6. The presidency as guardian, not monarch. Modern presidents inherited enormous power, but they also inherited limits. Roosevelt expanded executive authority, yet he anchored it in public responsibility. The presidency became a guardian role, not an ownership role. Presidents were judged on outcomes, not intentions. This accountability preserved democracy even as power centralized. 7. The courts as balance wheels. Judicial oversight remained critical. Regulation passed through courts. Executive actions were challenged. Corporate behavior faced legal boundaries. Roosevelt respected courts, not because they agreed with him, but because they stabilized the system. That respect became institutional habit. The result was slow, sometimes frustrating, but durable governance. 8. Environmental awareness as cultural memory. By the modern era, environmentalism was no longer fringe. National parks were treasured. Public land was defended. Conservation was mainstream. Most people did not know Roosevelt created this foundation. They simply assumed nature deserved protection. That assumption was revolutionary and permanent. 9. Education and civic expectation. Roosevelt believed citizens should understand their system. Civic responsibility mattered. Over time, this belief shaped public education. Civics became standard. Public debate normalized. Participation became expected, even when engagement declined. The framework remained. Citizens were still expected to care. 10. Inequality returns, but not unchecked. Economic inequality increased in later decades. Technology rewarded scale. Capital concentrated. Wages stagnated. Yet inequality did not erase oversight. Public debate intensified. Regulatory proposals emerged. Antitrust re-entered conversation. Roosevelt's ideas returned whenever imbalance grew too large. They never fully disappeared. 11. Global influence without total control. America influenced global systems, but did not control them. Trade required compromise. Diplomacy demanded restraint. Power required justification. Roosevelt's foreign policy philosophy, strength with responsibility, shaped this balance. America acted forcefully, but rarely without explanation. This preserved alliances and legitimacy. 12. Why the system still works. Mostly, the system works not because leaders are perfect. It works because failure does not destroy it. Mistakes occur. Corrections follow. Institutions endure. Roosevelt designed resilience, not certainty. That choice mattered more than any single reform. 13. Ordinary life as proof of success. The greatest proof of Roosevelt's legacy is not historical memory. It is boredom. People expect systems to function. They assume safety. They complain about inconvenience, not survival. That quiet normality is rare in history. It was built deliberately.